What's up guys, Deroir here and welcome to another episode of Hype Time. So last time I discussed the pros and cons of having the storyline and the open world content of Heart of Thorns integrated into the living world concept. This time I want to talk a little bit more about story, specifically storytelling. Throughout this week we've gotten several blog posts, one of which outlined what had happened in season 2 of the living story, and one that basically just recapped the overall idea behind Heart of Thorns. Though they contain no major announcements, they are definitely good reads, especially if you feel yourself missing a few of the underlying aspects and ideas that Heart of Thorns is created upon. Feel free to check them out in the description down below, along with Friday's livestream, which provided a bit more insight into the topic of storytelling. Well, one thing I want to highlight from their latest blog post is their paragraph about replayability, storytelling, and retelling. Now, essentially what ArenaNet says they've done with Heart of Thorns is that they've made sure that when players experience the story of Heart of Thorns, there are ample reasons and rewards to justify going back and doing it all over and over again. We took a page from the Living Stories book and made our story-specific instance content replayable so that players can give the instances a second, third, or fourth try anytime they like. Now, one of the biggest problems I've heard the devs at ArenaNet mention about their production of the base game was just how much time and how many resources actually went into creating certain branching storylines for players to experience, and yet only a handful of players ever experience the entire thing. The majority of the player base only ever get a small dip into the broad variety of racial stories that are created to define your character. Now, to counter this, as I quoted, they're introducing the option of replaying every single story step. By introducing achievements and loot to subsequent attempts at the same story instance, just like we've seen in the living story instances, they're aiming to incentivize players to actually utilize this feature of replayability. But the thing is, key story instances also have binary choices that define how the story unfolds. Many of these choices are said to revolve around the theme of trusting or not trusting the Sylvari, just like we've seen in the beta, where you can choose to trust or not trust Larenthir. This means that some story instances will have 2 or possibly more branching storylines to follow, allowing for some achievements to only appear in certain paths. By doing this, they can accomplish several things. But just a quick note first though, I'm sorry if I've caught your curiosity as to what I might say on this topic, but I guess I have to at least put out a small warning of sorts before continuing along a more speculative track on this subject. If you don't want your future story experience potentially ruined, you probably should just stop watching now. Anyways, back to the subject. Achievements and loot are awesome incentivizers for many players, and so by having the incentive in place for players to partake in all aspects of the storyline, ArenaNet can suddenly put in a lot more effort in a single story instance and still expect a significant return on that investment. That is the amazing part of this. It extends the narrative experience far beyond a single playthrough of any story. But by incentivizing players to partake in all aspects of the story, regardless of whether or not you or your role-playing character identify with the other decision in any given story, what they also accomplish is the destruction of the illusion of choice. Now, the illusion of choice is a strong tool in many aspects of our social life, but it is most significantly observed in interactive narrative experiences, especially video games. Of course, there are several layers and levels of such an illusion that I won't go too much into in this video, but essentially it revolves around the idea of giving the player the option of choosing between 2 possibly binary solutions to a given problem or situation, like trusting or not trusting the Sylvari. The assumption that your choice will make a difference is what makes you find yourself playing through certain games, going through a myriad of emotional, logical, moral, or ethical dilemmas in the process of choosing whether to do one thing or the other. The illusion is the assumption that your choice will make a difference. To many developers, making every choice actually matter is often way too expensive. Think of it this way: the longer the divergence of a given story branch is from the main storyline, the more real choice you could say there is, but the more expensive it also becomes to create, which is exactly the reason why ArenaNet is making their branching choices always pay off within the same story instance, so players see the result of their decision right away. Now, one of the biggest problems that the player base initially voiced about the narrative experience of the base game was the fact that no matter which choice you made throughout the story, everyone would eventually end up within the exact same situation with little regard to their previous choices. I would argue that that notion might be misconstrued a bit. The illusion of choice is not necessarily a bad thing for any game. In fact, it intensifies the experience for most games. It's only once you realize you've been tricked that it actually bothers you. And so seeing this, I believe many players actually misunderstood what most of their choices in Tyria actually revolved around. Let me just remind you guys that Guild Wars 2 is an MMORPG. The choices you make in this game are not meant to define the universe. They're meant to define your character, your role per se, which might also be the reason why ArenaNet is adding a lot more actual lines of dialogue to your character with Heart of Thorns, simply to strengthen the awareness of personality for that character. Now, the main problem that then appear with the choices in Heart of Thorns is the fact that even though your character is supposed to take a moral stand regarding the Sylvari, you not only have the option of immediately going back on your decision and just replay the instance once something turns sour, you can also never really maintain the feeling of agency that the illusion of choice is supposed to create, since you end up playing both paths of any story just to get the achievements, and thus suddenly you're identifying with both trusting and not trusting the Sylvari, leaving every story-enlightened schizophrenic character in a state of limbo regarding their own identity. I joke with it because I also know that the paradox I put forth will mostly only be annoying to some players. Other players might relish with the fact that they don't have to identify with the choice they pick. And lastly, there's the players that simply enjoy just getting the full picture of the story. That is, of course, if this paradox actually does present itself in the final product. Perhaps the devs have constructed a really clever way to work around this and actually add a lot more impact to the choices you make. Possibly binding your initial story choice to that character, but maybe only have that represented in the open world with stuff like ambient talk or special dialogue with NPCs and whatnot. They did say that in order to add impact to player choices, they consciously broke one of the main game's cardinal storytelling rules and allowed key characters to exist in both story instances and in the open world. Either way, do keep in mind that the story of Guild Wars 2 is linear in regards to the overall story. We're all headed towards the dragon in one way or the other. The choices in the story are meant to define your role in the story, not necessarily the outcome of it. But tell me guys, do you care about your character's role, or do you only mind the overall story? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. I personally can't wait to experience the more darker side of storytelling that Scott hinted would be more prominent in Heart of Thorns. And since that seems to be where the story is headed, I might come back and discuss the immortality paradox of narrative engagement with you guys if that's something you care to listen to. But for now, that's all I had this time for you guys. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, I will see you in the mists.